Yeah, we're good. All right, Freilach. With the help of Hashem, we are learning Pesachim Daf Mem. We are learning the sugya that began with the Mishnah Daf Lamed Tesamid Beis concerning various actions that may or that will not bring about the chimutz process. We're going to learn today, as we already touched upon a few times, but today it's going to be a machlokes, Abaye and Rava, whether we say that may peiros are machmitzim or not. Even those who say that may peiros are not machmitzim, truth be told, there's a big machlokes rishonim, and this is really of Daf Lamed Hey Amid Beis, between Rashi, between Rabbeinu Tam. What does that mean? Does it mean, like we read, I hope we read the Rabbeinu Tam, that goes to the extreme, that if you say may peiros ein machmitzim, it means it's ein machmitzim legamrei, or it only means that it doesn't bring about a bona fide, full-fledged chimutz, but it begins the chimutz process, and therefore the product, if you eat it on Pesach, you're not going to be chayiv kares, but you're eating something that we call chametz nuksha, which is something that is a little bit chametzdik. So that's a very important machlokes in halacha. How do we apply what we will learn today, the machlokes hamayroyim now, whether may peiros machmitzim or not? We're going to learn about the concept of shmura. We say shmura matzah. So we are guarding the matzah. Now we already learned to limud that it doesn't only mean to guard it, that it should not become chametz. We learned that we have to guard it in order for this to be for the mitzvah of matzah, l'shem mitzvahs matzah. Question we're going to learn today is, from when does the shimur process, does the shimur mitzvah begin? Are you guarding it when you mix the flour with the water? Because that is where take, if you don't guard it, it's going to become chametz. Or that's such a given that you have to make sure that when you need it, you don't allow it to become chametz, because the Torah says you can't eat chametz. That maybe the shimur already means that you have to start guarding it at a point prior to the kneading it. And we're going to see a very practical application of that question, whether shimur begins even before the kneading process. We're going to learn in Daf Mem Amud Beis the prohibition of adding flour to a cooking pot on Pesach, and it's going to lead us in the new Mishnah that's actually going to start speaking about dinim in the Korban Pesach, and that's going to go already into the next daf as well. And as the Torah says in Parshas Boy, that al toichlu mimenu na, that we're not allowed to eat a Korban Pesach partially roasted. The Gemara will define better what that means. Nor uvashel mevushel bamoyim, nor cooked in water. Ki im tzliesh, you have to roast it. You have to roast it in one piece. Roshai, al kirav, al kirbay. So we're going to learn many dinim, many practical dinim of exactly what may not be done to the Korban Pesach and how the Korban Pesach has to be prepared. Chavra, let us start on Daf Mem Amud Aleph. We left off fourth line from the top of the Amid, as the Gemara began on Daf Lamed Tesamid Beis, regarding the theoretically, when you roast, when you bake flour, then it can never become chametzik again. Nevertheless, right, the Gemara already mentioned, be careful. Don't use flour even if the flour was previously baked in the oven, because maybe it wasn't baked properly. Then we learned the statement, right, that a person on top of the Amid should not scald two kernels together. Scalding also is something, as we mentioned, that if you properly scald flour or kernels, it will no longer become chametz. But if you're going to be scalding two kernels together, by the fact that one might have established itself, might have sat in the cleft of the other, so the boiling water might not have reached the entirety of the kernel. So then not only did you not prevent it from becoming chametz because you scalded it, but now there's water in the kernel. And now just it's a matter of time for it to become chametz. That's where we left off. The Amar Abaya, you guys have it 4 lines on the top of the Amid. Don't singe, right? That's putting in fire 2 stalks of grain together. Why? Now we're learning about something else. What might happen if you put it into fire? So what's the issue? The issue is that kernels have within them natural moisture. And when you singe them, when you put them near fire, that moisture is drawn out. Now, the moisture of the same kernel in the kernel will never make that kernel chametzdik. If not, every kernel will be chametzdik. But if the moisture of one kernel would go into the other, now liquid from the kernel is not mayim. It's not mashkin, it's meipedes, right? So that's the meipedes. Don't singe 2 stalks of grain together, because because as you are singeing it, and again the water will be drawn out, the liquid, the moisture will be drawn out, but the moisture of one kernel might go into the other kernel, and it's going to make it chametzik. Obviously, Abaya holds that meipedes are machmitzim. However, Amalei Rava, if that's your fear, you're saying that you could do 1. You just can't do 2. How can you even singe 1? I get it. Even Rava knows that Abaya is not going to be afraid of the moisture in the same kernel if you don't move it around. But the moment you put even 1 kernel near fire, and you're moving around the liquid, so the liquid goes from one end to the other end. So first of all, that can be. That even if the water does go, it moves around in 1 kernel, it can go from one end to the other. There's no problem, because meipedes ninu umeipedes eina machmitzim. And obviously Abaya holds that meipedes are machmitz. But even though Abaya holds that meipedes is machmitz, nevertheless, Abaya took back his chumrah, but for another reason. And that is the kol agav midalayu, that while the liquid is flowing out of the kernels, loy machmitziyat, and when they are flowing out, they won't be potent enough to permeate themselves, to go into another and to be machmitz another kernel. It's flowing out into the fire. And how do we know that Abaya retracted that ruling? Because really, as we'll see, Abaya does hold that meipedes are machmetz. Because we know that the Amar Abaya once said that Hai Chatzba, the Avishuna, that this jug, as we mentioned, Avishunas that they used to roast or they used to toast grain in an oven, and they would put the grain in this keli, in this chatzba, in this jug. So he said like this, that if the jug is upside down, because again, when you put things in the oven, the moisture is drawn out, but the moisture won't be, so to say, stuck in the bottom of a keli. If it's upside down, the moisture will flow out into the fire, then it's okay. Only zekifa, then it's us. Only if the keli is standing the way you normally put a keli, so then the moisture will stay in the bottom of the cup. After a while, it's going to become evaporated in the oven, but until then, again, Abaya holds meipedes is machmetz. But as long as there is an escape route for the moisture, this concept that while the juices from here, the grain, while they're flowing, they won't be able to be machmetz, Abaya now subscribes to this. And therefore now Abaya will allow for you to singe 2 stalks of grain at the same time. Rava holds, even if you are roasting or toasting grain in an oven in a keli that's laying the way a keli normally lays, the bottom is in the bottom, which means that the moisture will get stuck in the bottom for a while. There's no problem, because meipedes ninu umeipedes eina machmitzim. So here, guys, Pesachim daf mem, machlokes Abaya and Rava, whether meipedes are machmitz or not. And again, as we have a klal, that whenever Abaya and Rava argue, halach is like Rava, a side of Yal Kigam. So Taka, we paskin that meipedes are not machmitz. Again, just quickly referring back to the Flamed Hey Amid Beis in the big Tosfos on the top of the Amid, which goes almost all the way down to the entire Amid, where Tosfos quotes the Rabbeinu Tam. The Rabbeinu Tam is the sheet that we spoke it out. Perush Rabbeinu Tam. I'm reading Tosfos the Flamed Hey Amid Beis. The A machmitzim kol ikir. Meipedes is not machmitz at all. Versus Rashi and other Rishonim that hold that meipedes, even according to Rava, it cannot make chametz gomer, but it can create chametz nuksha, and therefore we avoid using meipedes. Very important machlokes. I'm just putting things together, Danny. We spoke about, I think, the avocado putting on top of matzah. There, we're speaking about a chumrah on top of a chumrah. You know, it's when we're speaking about the chumrah that we have not to have gebraks. Here we say that if it's meipedes, no problem at all. But don't forget, here we are putting the meipedes or the avocado on something that went into the oven. And me'iked adin, everything that went into the oven can never become chametz, even with water. But when you're speaking about flour, putting flour in meipedes, machlokes Abaya and Rava, and a machlokes Rishonim, even though we paskin like Rava that meipedes ein machmitzim, what does that mean? the Rabbeinu Tam is very lenient. It's not machmitz at all. You can lechatchila put flour in meipedes on Pesach and not be concerned about anything. Okay.
Rabbi, how does it connect to
one of
the
the steps that was done to grain before they removed the klipa, before they pounded it to remove the klipa from the kernels, is that they would soak it in water. They would soak it in water when the kernels are in its klipa. Now, says the Gemara, Tanu Rabbanan, right at the end of the top white line, you may not soak barley grains in water. Guys, don't jump. How can you put it into water? Theoretically, they would put it into water for a very short amount of time. Yeah, the water would make the klipa wet. But one might have thought the amount of time that they would soak these kernels before they would pound it and remove the shell, the klipa, was very short, and maybe the water won't be able to go into the kernel. So for that, the Braisa has to say, no, we don't allow you to do that. I'll tell you another detail. Even if the water works its way into the kernel, as long as you are continuously working, pounding the kernels and making it into flour, and right away mixing the flour into the water and eating it, as long as we are not letting any part of these barley and any product of the barley, as long as it doesn't rest, it's theoretically never going to become chametz. Forget about 18 minutes. But we're very machmer. So the Braisa says that we are not allowed to do the lasisa process to barley. The im nosas, but if you did soak it in water, don't jump and say it's chametz. Why not? You look, if the kernels inside the barley kernels, nizbaku, if they split, that's a raya that indeed water made its way into the kernel, and then they are asurais. However, loy nizbaku, but if they did not split, then mutarais, gavaldik. Okay, Rabbi Yossi Omer, that if you did soak them into water, and now, let's see what he's saying. Now they're splitting. There's a solution for it, and that is shoydan b'chaimetz. Right away, soak them in vinegar, and we're going to have a lot on today's daf about vinegar. And b'chaimetz soimtzon, the vinegar will contract it. The vinegar will stop the chimutz process. Again, water went into the kernel; it doesn't become chametz right away. It starts to become chametz. So the antidote to chametz, Rabbi Yossi is putting it or soaking it in vinegar. Amar Shmuel, I want you to know that in halacha, Rabbi Yossi, that vinegar doesn't have that power to stop the chimutz process. If the chimutz process begun, then there's nothing you can do with it. You have to get rid of it. Amar Abchizda, Amar Marubukra, that I want you to know that when the Braisa, the Tanakama, is saying that if it's split, you got yourself a problem. He doesn't mean that it's problematic if it actually split. If you were to put these kernels of barley on top of a barrel of wine. Now, the strong wine vapors, they cause barley grains that are on the verge of splitting, it causes it to split. So if it already reached that level, but if you're going to put it on top of a barrel, that's what the Tanakama says. If it already reached that level, then you're not allowed to use them. Shmuel Amar, no. Shmuel is more lenient. That when do we have to be concerned? If you were loises barley, only if nisbaku mamish, then it is usher. If it didn't actually split, then you can make them into flour and no problem on Pesach. And actually, Avad Shmuel Uvda, Shmuel paskined like his leniency, Bidura, in the settlement, in the village, the Bei Bar Chashu, that what happened over there, that they daka soaked barley on Pesach, and someone says, "Oh, what are you doing? Why are you soaking it?" So the guy says, "Hold on." He took off the klipa, and it didn't split yet, but it was on the verge of splitting, and that's taka de machloikes. And Shmuel paskin that only nisbaku mamish is when you have a problem, and in that location, in that household of Bar Chashu, since it didn't actually split, Shmuel allowed them to use that barley flour on Pesach. Amar Rabbi, more about soaking. Baal nefesh. Baal nefesh means someone who's going beyond the letter of the law. Lo yilsa, should not soak grain on Pesach. Fragte Gemara, ma'ir Baal nefesh. Afilu kol almanami. Did we not learn the Tanya? We just learned the Braisa. Ein loises since yoyim bePesach. And we don't. Okay, Amar. So what explains the Gemara? The Braisa was speaking about barley. What Rabbi was adding is even wheat. Bal nefesh afilu chitin. Why is chitin different than soidim? Because chitin, naturally, the shiride, they are harder. It takes more time for the water to seep into it. And again, the soaking step before they would pound it to remove the klipa was a very quick step. It just cleaned it off more. And there's less chance for the water to make its way in the kernel. Abal nefesh lo yilsus. Amalei Rav Nachman, man detzayis leila abba. Whoever will listen to Abba, Abba's a lashon kibud, and he's referring to Abba, and what, they're going to be abal nefesh, and they're not going to soak wheat. So then ochal nahama the ipusha, they're going to eat spoiled bread. Because the way you clean the flour is by going through this lesisa. So a bal nefesh is going to have unclean bread on Pesach. The hall, Beit Rafuna Lassasin. I disagree with Rabbi. Rafuna, the household of Rafuna, you have a bal nefesh, but they would soak it. They would soak the wheat in water, mamish on Pesach, and then they would make bread up with it. Obviously, matzah dikeret. Ubei Rava bar Oven also Lassasi. The Rava Amar, the other extreme. Not only do I agree with Rabba, who was his teacher, but Rabba said it's only a chumrah of a bal nefesh. Rabba says, asur lilsois, you're not allowed to soak it. The Elyahu the Tanya, the Braisa only made an isur on so'oiden. And we already explained that the kernels of wheat are harder. So l'cha'ira, only so'oiden hu deloi, hachita shari, says the Gemara, no. Let me buy a kamar, pum faket. Let me buy a chitim. The is given the is beit sidia, there are clefts in them. It's not a smooth, round kernel. Avade, we should be afraid that Ailo Buhumaya, which is why you're not allowed to soak it. Abel Sadi, but one might have thought that when it comes to barley, since it's smooth, Mashaper Damim, Komashmul on the Braisa, that even soiden cannot be soaked. However, Zakti Gemara Hadabei Rabba changed this chumrah, he changed his mind. And now what does Rabba hold? That mutter lilsois. You are allowed to do this step of lesisa. Betanya, yoitzim bepasnikia, that a person can fulfill his obligation of eating matzah. If the bread is very white, the only way you would get white bread, that's the presumption, is if you would soak it first, if you would soak the kernels in water. You can also fulfill your mitzvah with hadra'ah, with very coarse bread, right? That bachlal, forget about soaking it. You ground it all up together, what we call whole wheat. The bran is in it. The E, so based on this premise that you can never really have white bread if you didn't do lasisa, the fact that it says in a braisa yoitzin b'pas nekiya, so Rava says that I take back. You are allowed to do lasisa. Again, barley not chitinia. Esvei Rav Papa Rava on this new premise, on his raya for his retraction, that you cannot have white bread. Can't have clean flour, white flour. I'm not speaking about bleached flour. That's not healthy. We're speaking about the emesdika white flour without soaking it. It says in a braisa, hakamachin flowers, v'hasolosois. Solosois means fine flour. Soilus means flour l'choira that underwent lasisa, especially based on this premise that you can't have real clean flour if you didn't first soak it before you took off the shell. Shel nachrim, if they belong to goyim. So it depends. Shel kefarim, if you bought them from goyim that live in the villages, then tohoidin. What does tohoidin mean? It means that they're not susceptible to tumah. Why would flour be susceptible to tumah? Because if they were wetted after they were cut off the ground, so now they're muhsal kabel tumah. In the villages, they never did the lasisa process. So therefore, as a rule, both stamp flour and soilless flour, if you buy them in the kfarim, they're tired because they never got wet. Only if you bought them in the krachim, then they are tamei, meaning that they are now susceptible to becoming tamei. Now, the kfarim, why are they tahirin? Because there was no contact with water. Yet we call this brisa calling it soilless. So you have an ayah that you could have fine flour even without lasisa. So why did Rabbi retract? So the Gemara says that Rabbi learned this brisa. He knew this brisa. But Targuma, he understood that the case of a soilless is only, when the kfarim tohirim, they only have kemach. There was never soilless that you can find in the kfarim. Okay, so we tried, Rav Papa tried to refute Rava's retraction. Rava explained how you can learn pshat in the brisa, and Rava went out. But Basar the Nafik, after Rava went out, Amar Rav Papa said to himself, I could have shrugged them up from something else. My time, why did I not question Rabbi? No, the chitin that I use for the carbon mincha, you're not allowed to soak them. Nevertheless, the Torah, when the Torah is speaking about a carbon mincha, the Torah many times uses the word soilus. So there it's soilus, and they used to, and it says clearly that you're not allowed to be loisus. So here you see that you could have white bread even without soaking it. Okay. Now the Gemara says, I want you to know, well, he didn't ask that to Rava in his presence, but Rava began by saying that it's asur. Then Rava said it's mutter. And now Rava nishtam retracted. Now Rava went min akotza lakotza. He went in the same direction. Not only are you allowed to do it, Hadar Amar Rava, that mutter lilsois. Now listen to this logic. Rava holds that there is a mitzvah for you to take the kernels of wheat and to soak them with water. Why? Because since it says, a pasuk in Parshas Boy, ushmartem es hamatzos, guard the matzos. Listen to this logic. If we would not have a mitzvah to soak it, is shimur lamai. Why does Hashem b'chlal say to guard it? If it means shimur delisha, you should guard it, that when you mix the flour in the water, make sure it doesn't become chametz. He says shimur delisha laf shimuru. That's not even called guarding. The Torah would not have to say to guard it. The Torah says don't eat chametz on Pesach. So it's self-understood that the moment you mix the flour in the water, which is where normally the chimutz process begins, of course you have to make sure that you bake it in a way where it doesn't become chametz. The fact that there's a mitzvah to guard it must mean, says Rava, listen to the logic, that you dafke do something to the kernels that makes it, so to say, vulnerable to becoming chametz, and then you're guarding it that it shouldn't happen. Dafke make it wet. Play with fire. Those that were made from goyim, that are not yet chametz. Now we have to know how to look at a dough. So here we begin learning some simanim, that if the dough did not crack and the color of the dough is not pale, these are simanim that we will learn, that when you look at a dough, you can notice whether the chimutz process began. So if it doesn't have these simanim, so when you imagine a goy made it, and you're looking at it and you notice there's no chimutz yet, Adam mimale kadeisoy mehem, a person can buy those doughs and make matzah and eat it, but you can't be yoytze the mitzvah of mitzvahs matzah, but it's not chametzik. You can eat it. But you should have a kazayas of matzah that was made by a yid at the end. What's at the end? What we call the afikoimen. The main mitzvah of eating matzah, right, midoiraisa, is eating it together with the carbon pesach. We eat the carbon pesach with matzah and with mother, and the carbon pesach we know is dafke eaten ala soiva. It's not eaten in the beginning of the meal. It's the dessert. Actually, many people teach afikoimen as dessert. So the main mitzvah of matzah now, it's not when you make the bracha alachilas matzah. According to this Gemara, it's when you eat it at the end, when you eat afikoimen. That is something that may not come from a dough that was kneaded by goyim. But as far as the issue of whether it's chametzik or not, you can, if as long as it's not chametzik, you can eat it. Now, ba'achroina in barishayna loy, why can't you have it barishayna? Must be because it wasn't made with shimur. My tama mishum deliyavet b'hu shimur, because it was not guarded. But what's the issue? What's the problem? You're buying the dough. That means that after you buy the dough from the goyim, you still have to shape it. Then you have to put it into the oven. All of that will be done l'shem mitzvahs matzah. If shimur, which means make sure it doesn't become chametz, let's go with what we learned in the last year, l'shem mitzvahs matzah. If all of that is only shayach to the kneading process, then even if the goyim began to knead it, but you're still going to finish shaping it and putting it into the oven and do the shimur then, right? The word afiyah doesn't mean from when it goes into the oven, but in the steps that you will still have to do until it goes into the oven. So you can do shimur. The problem, the reason why you may not use doughs that you bought from goyim for the mitzvah of matzah is because it has to be l'shem mitzvahs matzah. But the l'shem mitzvahs matzah, guarding it for matzah, doesn't begin with the kneading. It begins with that which happens before the kneading. So if you bought already the dough, that means that the guy brought it into that level. And even though you know it's not chametz, but it's lacking in the shimur. Shimur meikara be'inon.
Rabbi,
That's not a proof.
Can you just clarify?
Or l'shem mitzvahs matzah is only during the kneading, but it has to be through the whole kneading process, not at the end of the kneading process. Right before shaping it is not enough. Umimai dilma shani hasam the beidna the nachas l'shimur from when you mix the flour and the water lo yavad b'hu shimur. Maybe shimur only means guarding it. It shouldn't become chametz. Guarding it l'shem mitzvahs matzah from when you mix the flour and the water. I know that you still have to shape it to put it into the oven. But if you bought the betzeka from the nachli, from the beginning, there was no shimur, from the beginning of the kneading. But maybe, as long as you did have the shimur, it shouldn't become chametz, and you're guarding it l'shem mitzvahs matzah from when you mix the flour and the water, maybe, that's called shimur. So Rabbi, who changed his mind by saying that we want you to soak the kernels in water, in order for there to be a vulnerability, now you have to really get it out of the water quick. You got to take off the klipa. That's exactly what God wants. Guard it. It should not become chametz because you did something that might bring it to chametz. You have no raya from here. So even though there's no raya, but Rabbi did not change his mind. Guarding must take place, according to Rabbi, even before the lisha. Guys, when you say matzah shmura, hand-baked matzah has nothing to do with shmura, has nothing to do. There's matzah that's hand-baked, and there's matzah shmura. Matzah shmura is mishas lisha. All of this will be in the box of the matzah. Or you'll be machmer like Rava, who holds that shmira has to begin prior to. Now our shmura matzah is really shmura mishas ktsira. But what Rava is, he's adding a nuance. Not only shmira mishas ketzira, that from when you harvest it off the ground, making sure that it never gets any contact with liquid. It's more than that. Rava says, no, I want you to soak it for a moment in water and then quickly get rid of that water by getting rid of the klipa. The Amar Lahu Lahanu the Mahapchi Kipe, Rava told the people who would turn over the sheaves once they were already cut off the ground. That's mamash from the ketzira. They would move them around. And so Rava would tell them that Ki Mahapechisu, when you turn these stalks over, hafichu l'shum mitzvah, already do it l'shem mitzvahs matzah, which means make sure that it doesn't go in a place that's moist, what we call shmira mishas ktsira. Alma, why did he tell them l'shem mitzvah? That's because kosavar, that shimur me'ikara mitchilasei da'atzayfei be'inan. From when you cut it off the ground, when it's connected to the ground, it doesn't matter if it gets wet. Everything in the ground gets wet. There's the moisture of the ground. It rains on it. But from when you harvest it all the way until the end, you need shimur the entire time. But coming back, I don't think that we soak them in water. What we call shmira mishas ketzira is what Rava said here at the end. Make sure that there's never any contact with water. You have to know in what season to harvest it. You have to know how to store it. You have to know how to transport it, that it shouldn't be shayach that any moisture touch the kernels. What Rabbi here is saying is, no, I want you to soak it in water quickly. It was probably for a moment, mamish, just to wash off the dirt. And now you really got to be careful. Now you got to be shoyim it. Okay.
Rabbi, can you hear me?
Says the Gemara at the end of the Yomid. Mar,
I guess not.
The son of Ravina. Isn't it amazing? Ravashi, Ravina, Chavedim, right? Ravashi had a son called Mar bar Ravashi, and Ravina, Talmud Chaver of Ravashi, also had a son called Mar. Mar b'nei de Ravina, Daf Mem Amud Beis, is menak dolei imei ba'arbei. His mother would store the grains for him in basins, meaning, like Rashi says, from when she harvested the grains, she put it in basins, she put it in a keli with caution that there should be no moisture in the keli, and the kelim should be covered. Well, it's the mamish, the poil mamish that we have shmira mishas ketzira. Okay, says the Gemara, Hanu arbe dechita. There was a boat filled with wheat kernels, and the tava, and it sunk in the river called Chishta. Now, today, if you tell a person that the kernels went into the water, they'll say, chazer treif. What did we learn, Bekitzan, in the whole Amad Aleph? L'sisa, lav dafka. when a kernel, especially if the kernel is still in its shaft, when that gets wetted, they used to soak it in water. Even the Braisa that says you shouldn't do it to barley, the Braisa says, but if you did it, see if it got cracked, see if it split. It doesn't become chametzik right away. So what is there a way to salvage? You had all your merchandise. It got. Now this happened before Pesach. So says the Gemara that Sharia Rava l'shitasenach, that you can lizavune lenachim, sell it to goyim. He began by saying sell it to goyim. Yeah, you're right. It sunk into the water. Maybe in that case it was in the water too long. There's for certainty that some of the kernels absorbed water. That's what we're learning, that when water enters the kernels, they become chametzik if they're not being moved around after a certain point. Sell it to goyim. Now we got yourselves a problem, because we're going to, in fact, about Eisvei Rabba bar Levoyi to Rabba, it says in a Braisa that beged she'avad by kalayim. See, sometimes when linen gets mixed into a woolen garment, you can identify the linen thread, which is a good thing. So then you can remove it. Fakert, or today, when you send it to a shotness lab. So yeah, this jacket had shotness. So they find it. So they find it in the collar and they remove it. They can see where it is and they remove it. What happens if the linen thread is not discernible? You know what's in there. So here, the problem is not only that a yid cannot wear it. It says in a braisa, lo yimkerenu hareze lo yimkerenu lenachri. Do not sell it to a goy. Why? Because since it's not discernible, maybe a goy will sell it to the yid, and the Jew won't know that it's shotnes. Imagine. Likewise, v'layasem by mardaas. The issur of shotness is to wear it derech malbush. If you have a mardas, is the saddle blanket that's very hard. It's not something that you wrap yourself in. Midoiraisa, you can sit on a saddle blanket even if there is shotness in it. Eloma midrabanan, you're not allowed to do that because there's a chashash, either that a thread will come out, the shotness, and it will go around you. Even if you don't have that chashash, then the issue is that sometimes when a person has a beged that needs to get patched, there's a hole in it, there's a blemish in it, someone might cut a piece of the mardas that was made for the chamoid and use that as a patch. People that were poor, beged was something very chashuv then. So therefore, midrabanan, you can't even use that for a mardas lechamoid because it might make its way onto a yid's garment. The only thing you can use this beged for is tachrich and lameis, because since there is an issur to have hana'ah from anything that was made for a mace, so therefore we're not afraid that it's from the tachrich and it's going to go onto your body. Coming back, one of the things you may not do with this beged is you can't sell it to a goy. And why not? L'nachri mai tamaloi lav mishum the hadar mizaben liyisrael, because we are choishish that he might sell it to a yid. So how did the Rava paskin that those kernels that sunk into the river of Chishta, that Rava felt, even though mutter lilsois, but that's when you're controlling it. In that case, it sunk into the river. No one was controlling it. There was no shimur. Hitaka was afraid that the kernels became chametzik. But the problem is, how can you sell it to a goy? The goy might sell it to a yid. And Rava therefore changed this psak. That's the greatness of Rava. They challenged him. He said, fine. Hadrama Rava, okay, can't sell it to goyim. But lasbinu, don't throw it away yet. Lasbinu kaba li Yisrael, sell very small amounts to every small amount of one kav to another Yiddish family, because this happened not on Pesach. It happened shortly before Pesach. So he was mishayir. What is the amount of grain that you would sell to a family that we can assume halachically, even if you're going to be machmer and be chayish, that by Pesach for sure they consumed it. One kav was that amount. Certainly, if you're only going to sell to one family one kav, by the time, whenever the story happened, whether a day before, a week before, whatever it was, that amount will be consumed before Pesach. This story, guys, just underlines the amazing psak of Rava that he says it's a mitzvah to soak it. So when it fell into the water, I got yourself a problem. Sell it to a goy, you can't sell it to a goy, smell the small amounts. But if you control the process, Adarabba, you are now fulfilling the mitzvah of shimur. We learned in a braisa, moving the ingen. What are we moving on to? That people, when they would cook a pot of food, and if the food would be very liquidy, one of the solutions of thickening the pot thickening the food in the pot will be to add flour. And neshamot, theoretically, flour that is in boiling water cannot become chametz. But we are afraid that not all the flour will right away be in boiling water. And then not only will it become chametz because it's in contact with water, but lukewarm water. And warm water, it speeds up the chimutz process. So never throw flour in a boiling pot. But if you do want to thicken the pot by putting flour, so noisen es hakemach, that put the kemach into the boiling pot, and right afterwards put in vinegar. So we had vinegar already on Amud Aleph in the Braisa about not soaking barley, and if the barley is cracking, Rabbi Yossi, who Shmuel says we don't paskin like, but Rabbi Yossi says you put vinegar in it, vinegar contracts it. Here we're learning about not contracting, but here we're saying that chametz doesn't allow something to become chametz. Same concept. So if you put flour in a pot, even though we can't rely on the fact that all of it got scalded, we're not going to say that. But you are afraid, oy gewalt, it's not in boiling water, maybe for a moment, and now it's going to become chametz de quick. The solution is add vinegar. The yesh even more lenient. Now this is very important. When you have a pot and you put vinegar in it, so if the vinegar is in the pot for a moment, the vinegar gets diluted in everything else in the pot. If the vinegar was in the pot before you put the flour, the vinegar is less potent. So the first version holds that if you did put flour in a pot, you don't have to throw it out. Add vinegar. That for sure is good. Because when the vinegar hits the pot, it's going to hit the flour before the vinegar got diluted. So then it's for sure going to be effective in stopping the chimutz process. The V'yesh Oimrim says that even if the vinegar was first in the pot, so it already is, so to say, mixed into the whatever else is in there. So it's weakened, it still has the koyach to stop the chimutz process. Man yesh Oimrim, so Amar Rab Chizda, that's Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, ilfos, a frying pan, ve'akdeira, or a pot, shehe'evira miruschin, that they were removed from the fire. What are we speaking about over here? We're speaking about Hilchos Shabbos, even though they're not on the fire. But if they were removed from the fire shortly before the beginning of Shabbos, and now Ben Hashmoshes comes, a moment later comes, and it's already off the fire, says the Mishnah, Lo yitin l'toichem tavlin. Don't put spices in it, because that's a klei rishoin, it's still way beyond Yatzei Ledas boy, and it's going to cook the tavlin on Shabbos. Avol, noisin l'toich ha'ka'ara, but if that which was on the fire was moved over to another keli, to a bowl, to any other keli, so now you are in a klei sheni. In a klei sheni, you can put spices. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, lakoel hu noisin. You may add spices to anything. You may add spices to anything. Again, he's not arguing with the Tanakama. If it's Rashi says, if it's a klei sheni, chutz midavar sheyesh by chametz, if something has in it vinegar, or if something has in it fish brine, that chametz speeds up the cleaning, the cooking process. So if it speeds up the process, even though it's in a klei sheni, it still can cook. So what do we see from Rabbi Yehuda? We see from Rabbi Yehuda that even though the chametz is already in the pot before you put the spices in, so you would say maybe the chametz is already weakened, it's already mixed in the pot. Still, the koyach of chametz to speeden up the cooking process happens even if the chametz was in the pot before you put in the spices. So that's the link, that if chametz was in the pot before you put in the flour, chametz is, even though it's diluted there, it's already in the pot with other things, it still has the koyach to speeden up the cooking process, and that's the antidote, not allowing something to become chametz. Says the Gemara, I'm not disagreeing with the fact that the yesh oimrim could be Rabbi Yehuda, but why didn't you say that it's like Rabbi Yossi, as we learned today on Amud Aleph, the Tanya? Rabbi Yossi says that if a person soaked barley, and the barley is a swelling, and if once it cracks, you got yourself a problem. So he says, shoydan b'chometz, and chometz soimson, these are the words that we learned. In other words, chometz has the power to contract, to make it stop expanding, it's very different than what we learned right now. Here we're learning that vinegar speeds up the cooking process. Once it's cooked, it cannot become chametzik. Here, the Rabbi Yossi is saying that vinegar contracts everything, but it's also good because it's not allowing it to become chametz. So why didn't we say that the V'yeshemnem is Rabbi Yossi? So says the Gemara, Kiyash me'in and Leila Rabbi Yossi, Hanamila de Isa be'enai. In other words, you added the chametz. The chametz was not mixed with anything else. You have kernels of barley. You are noticing that they're becoming swollen. Put them in chametz. Chametz is completely not diluted. Bechlal not diluted. You put it in chametz. But here, the Brais is being machadish to the Yeshayim that chametz, whatever chametz does, in a way where it resolves the problem, the fear of something becoming chametz, we're saying that you can put the Yeshayim that even if chametz is in a pot with other things, and you added flour, you are good. That we don't know. We don't know from Rabbi Yossi that chametz is that potent. And yes, fakert, from the din and Hilchos Shabbos, from Rabbi Yehuda, the Yesh Oimrim is Rabbi Yehuda. Says the Gemara Vayit. Ula Omer. Echad zeh ve'echad zeh. I don't care if the vinegar was in the pot first, which is not as good as, because the vinegar is diluted. I don't care if you're going to put flour and right away put vinegar on top. I'm not challenging the theory that theoretically vinegar will speeden up the cooking process and the flour won't become chametz, v'chulei. Don't do that. You're playing with fire. Echad zeh ve'echad zeh aser. And the example, the mashal that we learned, that we're going to have this many times, and this is an expression that we say to a nazir. If someone made a vow to be a nazir, they are theoretically allowed to walk through a vineyard. Why can't they walk through a vineyard? They're not eating. They're just walking through it. Nevertheless, you know what you tell a nazir? Lech, get out of here. Go away, we tell a nazir. You have a vineyard, schor, go around the vineyard. Why are you playing with fire? In other words, Ula, just like we spoke about, Ula says what you're gonna tell a person that if you add the vinegar last, then you're good. So people are gonna put flour in a pot on Pesach. Can you imagine today? Never. And then add vinegar. Yeah, he's not arguing with the Metzias that if you put vinegar right away on the flour, it's gonna cook it quick. Don't do that. Don't play with fire. Don't add flour into water in a pot. Again, the issue is, like we mentioned, if the water is boiling and it touches the whole flour, then there's no problem. But I know how careful we are right now when we make matzah, that the water should be room temperature. The warmer the water is, if it's not scalding hot, it's going to be mamahed the chimutz process. Never put flour into a pot. Says the Gemara Vayter, Rav Papa Sharelei Liburdike. Rav Papa allowed the bakers of the household of the Reish Galusa lemimcha kedeira to thicken a pot with chasise. Chasise is, like we said, is that they used to many times take the kernels and put them in the oven, and then you make flour. So and again, when you taka oven baked kernels, that flour can never become chametz. So Rav Papi allowed that flour that came from oven baked, oven dried grain, that they should be allowed to thicken the pot, which is that's the sugi that we're learning about right now. They would like to thicken the pot. Again, no one is debating the theory. If you taka oven dried the flour properly, it was baked, the grains, if you oven dried the kernels, and then you make flour, okay, that flour can be used. But in the household of the Reish Galusa, where there's so many avadim working there, and the avadim are so lenient, they're so mizalzel b'mitzvahs, you think they're going to care what flour? If they're going to see that on Pesach you add flour to a pot, they're going to end up adding stump flour into a pot. And it might become chametzik. That's one version of Rava's criticism to Rav Papi. Ikeda Amri, that Rava gufa machele kidra b'chasise. Rava did it himself. Now, by the way, Rava did it himself either in a place where there's no avadim, or even where there's avadim. On Pesach, there are certain things that the avadim should not do. If you want to add flour to a pot, okay, so if you know that the kernels were oven dried, and therefore the flours cannot become chametz, you know that, you will make sure only to put that type of flour, so you do it. So Rava, you go into the kitchen and you put it into the flour. But to allow the house help, which are not necessarily as careful, that don't allow them even to use chasise because they might end up using normal flour. Okay, Gavaldi. Moving on to the next Mishnah. There's a lot of discussion in the Rishonim to understand the hemshech of the Mishnayos. But one way of learning it, the issue won't be with the first part of the Mishnah. The issue will be with the second part of the Mishnah. But I just want to quickly recap the last Mishnah. The last Mishnah on Daf Lamed Tes Amud Beis began to speak about that you're not allowed to soak bran, just the bran for chickens. Like we explained, maybe there'll be some residue of the kernels in the bran. Others say that bran itself can become chametzik, but you can be choilet. You can be choilet. Now, sometimes we say you can't do anything, loy plug. Here, the Chazal didn't say it. You can't soak it, but if you know how to scald it, this is before the rush and the rif that we spoke out. Today, we don't know how to scald it. You could do it. The Mishnah says that a woman cannot take mursan to the Beis HaMerchatz. Again, because bran with water can become chametzik. But she's allowed to rub mursan on her body when the mursan is dry. In other words, the Mishnah gave various halachas of there is a line, with water it's problematic, without water or in a different way it's not problematic, and we're not goizer ha-atuha, even though we're speaking about chametz on Pesach. So if that's going to be the nesham of the Mishnah, then this whole Mishnah will flow. First of all, charoises here is not the charoises that we eat on Pesach. Charoises means a dip. The dip that we use is a little bit sweet, right, to counter the bitterness of the mother. This is a charoises dip. This is a dip that was made to put meat in. The word charoises means dip. Now, part of the dip was water, was mayim. So says the Mishnah, don't put flour in charoises, as we are learning that if you put flour into water, if you leave it to rest, you have yourself a problem with chametz. Oi, don't put it inside mustard. Mustard dips also has water in it. But what happens if you did it? The imnasan yoichal miyad. Don't throw it out. It doesn't become chametz in 1 second. You eat it right away, it's not going to become chametz. Rav Meir says, oisen, because he holds that we'll see whether he's going to the charoises, whether he's going to both the charoises and to the chardal, that if you would not have the chardal in it, then it would take, let's say we say today, 18 minutes. So eat it right away. But now that there's something sharp in it, this concept that sometimes kemach becomes chametz almost immediately. Don't say eat it right away. Maybe by the time you'll eat it, a few seconds later, it's already chametzdik. You have to get rid of it. Next in the Mishnah, ein mevashlen es ha-Pesach. See, that's the question. What are we talking about? A carbon Pesach, like we mentioned in the introduction, the Torah says explicitly, it has to be tzli esht. It has to be roasted. And the Tanach says what it cannot be. It cannot even be partially roasted. It cannot be cooked in water. That's what the pasuk says. So you can't cook a Pesach. Not in mashkin. Mashkin refers to any one of the 7 liquids that are mashir. Yat shach adam. V'loy b'mei nor in any other mei pedis. Avol sachin, while you are roasting it and you want to baste it, you want to smear it with liquids, then you are allowed to do it. Avol sachin. And after it's roasted, you want to then dip it into some sort of liquid, that's okay. So the hemshech will be that we're not goizer ha'atuha. If that's the way you learn it, so now you understand the flow. Even though this part of the Mishnah, as we're going to learn on Daf Mem Aleph, we're going to completely move on. We're not speaking about matzah. We're not going to speak about chametz. We're going to speak about the dinim of preparing the carbon paste. Okay. The final part of the Mishnah, May tashmishoy shel nachtoim, water used by a baker. The bakers are kneading the dough, and they want to clean their hands. So they have near them, they have a basin of water. Now, being that their hands have flour on them, even though they're kneading the dough, but there'll be a shtickle flour, the water that they use to put their hands in, to clean their hands, inevitably will get some flour in it that's going to sit in the water. And therefore, yishafchu, you have to continuously pour it out, because there's chametz in it. There's flour in it. Gavaldik. Okay, says the Gemara. Let's begin. The first part of the Mishnah was about the not being allowed to put kemach, not in charoises, some sort of dip, not in chardel. And if you did it, machloikas tanoim. So Amar Rav Kahana, the machloikas tanoim is only l'toy chardel. But if you put it in charoises, even the Tanakama will be moide to Rabbi Meir that the possibility of the kemach turning into chametz is so quick that you can't say yoichel miyad. We have to make exeda. Don't eat it. Divrei akol yisaref miyad. And Tanya nami hachi, like Rav Kahana, ein noistan kemach l'toy charoises. Ve'im nasan yisaref miyad. Nekuda. No machloikas. If you put kemach inside of mustard and a mustard dip, now Rav Meir oimer yisaref miyad, and the chachamim say no, you don't have to burn it. Yoichel miyad. So says Rav Kahana. Amar Rav Huna bereider Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Shmuel. This is all Rav Huna bereider. That what? That halacha k'divrei chachamim. That you don't have to burn it miyad. You can eat the mixture right away. Amar le Rav Nachman Rav Yitzchak to Rav Huna bereider Rav Yehuda. Who was the one that quoted Rav Nachman Amar Shmuel that halacha k'divrei chachamim daf mem aleph? This halacha k'divrei chachamim was acharoisis ka'amar. Meaning, do they argue also concerning charoisis? And now that we're paskening like the chachamim yoichel miyad, or are they only arguing when it comes to chardel, which is the way Rav Kahana said that they only argue, right? Machloikas l'teicha chardel. Amalei lamai nafkamina. Lamai nafkamina, of course there's a nafkamina, means why would I differentiate? Why would I make a difference? So he says, Lid Rav Kahana. So now if we're going to follow Rav Kahana, even if we're going to paskin like the Chachamim, but that's only l'toich chardel. L'toich charoises, and these things were common. Then everyone would say you have to burn it right away. So Amalei, so Rav Huna tells Rav Nachman, Loi Shamili, I didn't hear Rav Kahana, which means I don't agree with Rav Kahana. I hold that they argue with both. We had a Braisa. The Braisa clearly says that they only argue, right? Clearly, the Toicha Chardel. So Tosfos says, we'll end with this Tosfos. Tosfos says on top of the Amid, Loi Shamili, look, Afal Gav the Tanya Kavase, nevertheless, Kosovar Masnis and Pliga. Look inside the Mishnah. If you look inside the Mishnah, it clearly, the pshat, it's a big doichik to put that comma in the Mishnah. The Mishnah says you can't put kemach in charoises, nor oi l'toicha chardel, and if you did it, you eat it. It's mashma from the Mishnah that the Chachamim, in all cases, hold yoichel miyad, and now that we paskin like the Chachamim, it goes on everything. Look up a few more lines. Amar Rav Ashi, I want you to know, you don't agree with Rav Kahana, but I say kavasi Rav Kahana b'stabro, that there is no machlokes between Amer and the Chachamim by charoises. If you put a kemach in this dip of charoises, again, this fear, everyone will agree, don't say eat it right away. How do you know what right away means? Throw it out, burn it. Vida Amar Shmuel, ein halacha Rabbi Yosi. That's the final time we're learning back this Rabbi Yosi that holds on Amud Aleph that if vinegar, if you have these barley kernels you were loisist them and now they are swelling and you want to stop the chimutz, put them into vinegar. And my love and Shmuel says we don't paskin like Rabbi Yosi, so my love samusahu deloitzamis that vinegar we don't say that vinegar contracts, but at least chamuye mechama. Chamoye mechama means that it's gonna stop the chimutz process, or it's going to finalize the cooking of it. It's not going to become chametznik. All of that is a rationale to say that in the charoises, obviously there was vinegar. That the chachamim don't say that you have to burn it right away. The chachamim even by the charoises say that you can eat it because the vinegar is a good thing. Vinegar is an antidote. Now, it doesn't contract it, but here it's stopping it from beginning. That it does. So the Gemara says that's not a proof. Dilma, when we don't paskin like Rabbi Yosi, we completely reject the potency of vinegar as an antidote. Maybe so you don't have a raya from that. So we have at the end we have a machlokes amoyroim. Whether the machlokes between Ameir and the Chachamim was only concerning chardel or even concerning Charoises, but wherever the Chachamim disagree with Rav Meir, here we have this tradition that we do paskin like the Chachamim, and we don't say loy plug. We say eat it right away. Don't have to eat it right away. If you eat it right away, there's not enough time for it to become chametz, God willing, to be continued.
Rabbi, can you hear us?
Danny, I can't hear you.
Yeah, I don't think you can hear any of us.
You can hear you.
We hear you, but you can't hear us.
You can hear me.
Yep.
Okay, good. I can't hear you. Sorry.
Is there a way to fix it?
You can text maybe. Can anyone hear Danny?
I can hear everybody. Have a lovely day. Continue the class.
Was no one able to talk in the whole time? Could be. I didn't hear anyone. Okay, so I'm going to stop my computer. I'm going to restart my computer. Okay, sorry, guys.